Duke Michael Thornbury stood before the portrait that had hung in his private study for 2 decades. Staring at the face he'd painted from memory of the mysterious girl who'd pulled him from a frozen river when he was 12 years old and then vanished before he could learn her name, never knowing that the woman he'd recently married, Duchess Grace Thornbury, was that same girl grown up. And she'd recognized him instantly on their wedding day, but said nothing because she believed he'd married her for political advantage rather than the connection she'd never forgotten. Grace watched her husband from the doorway of his study, her heart breaking as she saw him touching the portrait with such tenderness. The painting of a young girl with dark hair and green eyes that looked remarkably like Grace herself at 12. And she understood with devastating clarity that Michael had been searching for her all these years, while she'd been right in front of him for 6 months of marriage, invisible because he was looking for a memory rather than seeing the reality of his own wife. The portrait showed a girl in simple clothing pulling a boy from icy water, her face determined and fearful simultaneously. And beneath it was a small plaque that read, "She saved my life. I will find her," with a date from 20 years ago, the same winter Grace had risked everything to rescue a drowning boy she'd later learned was the young heir to the Thornbury dukedom, never imagining she'd grow up to marry him without him recognizing the connection that had defined both their lives. "You painted this yourself," Grace said quietly from the doorway, making Michael spin around with guilt written across his handsome features, as if he'd been caught doing something shameful rather than honoring a memory that clearly meant everything to him. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Michael's expression shifted from surprise to careful neutrality, the same polite distance he'd maintained throughout their 6 months of marriage, treating Grace with unfailing courtesy but never genuine warmth, never the kind of connection she'd hoped their union might develop despite its arranged nature. "I didn't hear you come in," Michael said, moving slightly as if to block her view of the portrait. "This is my private study. I wasn't expecting company." "I came to tell you dinner is ready," Grace said, stepping further into the room despite his obvious discomfort. "But Michael, that portrait, I've never seen it before. Who is she?" She knew exactly who the girl was, could see her own younger face captured in paint with remarkable accuracy, considering Michael had been 12 and half frozen when she'd pulled him from the river. But Grace needed to understand what this painting meant to him, needed to hear in his own words why he'd been searching for her while married to her. "Someone from my past," Michael said, his voice taking on a quality Grace had never heard before, soft and vulnerable in a way he never was with her. "A girl who saved my life when I was a child. I fell through ice while skating on the river near our country estate, and she pulled me out before I drowned. By the time I recovered enough to thank her properly, she'd disappeared. I've been searching for her ever since." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't quite name, a complicated tangle of hope and heartbreak and frustration. 20 years is a long time to search for someone," she observed carefully. "Michael, why? What do you hope to find if you locate her after all this time?" Michael looked at the portrait with such longing that Grace felt physically ill, watching her husband pine for a memory of her while showing his actual wife nothing but distant politeness. "She was brave," Michael said quietly. "This small girl couldn't have been more than 12 years old herself, and she didn't hesitate when she saw me fall through the ice. She ran onto that frozen river and pulled me out with strength I wouldn't have thought possible from someone her size. She saved my life without thought for her own safety, and then she disappeared before I could even learn her name." He touched the painting gently. "Never forgotten her face or her courage. My parents tried to find her to reward her bravery, but no one in the area knew who she was. It was like she'd been an angel sent to save me and then vanished. So I painted this from memory when I was 15, determined to find her someday and properly thank her for giving me my life." "If you found her," Grace asked, needing to understand what he truly wanted, "what would you do? Thank her and move on, or something more?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, and Grace saw conflict play across his features. "I don't know," he admitted. Part of me knows it's foolish to build up someone I knew for perhaps 10 minutes into this ideal. But Grace, she's been part of my life for 20 years. Every major decision, every challenge I've faced, I've thought about her courage and drawn strength from it. Finding her feels essential, like I can't fully move forward until I know who she became, until I can properly express the gratitude I've carried all these years. Even though you're married to me, Grace said, and couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. Michael, you've spent 6 months married to me, and I barely know you beyond polite conversation at dinner and formal events. But this girl from 20 years ago, this stranger you knew for minutes, you speak about her with more emotion than you've ever shown me. Michael looked stricken, apparently recognizing for the first time how his obsession might affect his actual wife. Grace, I apologize. You're right that I've been distant during our marriage. But you must understand, ours was an arranged union for political advantage. I never intended to give you false hope about developing romantic feelings. Because your heart belongs to a memory, Grace said bitterly. Michael, do you realize how sad this is? You're so fixated on an idealized girl from your childhood that you can't see the real woman you've married. You're living half a life, chasing a ghost while ignoring the person actually standing in front of you. That's not fair, Michael protested. I've been a good husband to you. I've provided for you, treated you with respect, never raised my voice or behaved cruelly. You've been polite, Grace corrected. Polite and distant and emotionally absent. Michael, I knew our marriage was arranged, but I hoped we might build something real over time. Instead, I'm competing with an idealized memory I can never measure up to because she exists only in your imagination, perfect and unchanging and forever 12 years old and impossibly brave. She moved closer to the portrait, studying her own young face captured in paint. What if you found her and she was disappointing? What if she grew up to be ordinary or difficult or nothing like the angel you've built her into? Would that destroy you, or would it finally free you to live in the present instead of the past? Michael looked troubled by the question, clearly never having considered that possibility. I don't think she could be disappointing, he said. Someone with that kind of courage and selflessness, those qualities don't just disappear. People change, Grace said. The brave 12-year-old girl might have become a cautious adult. Life has a way of wearing down courage and idealism. You're in love with a moment in time, Michael, not an actual person who's lived and grown and been shaped by 20 years of experience. I'm not in love with her, Michael said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. I'm grateful to her. There's a difference. There, Grace challenged. You've spent 20 years searching for her. You painted her portrait and hung it in your most private space. You speak about her with more warmth and emotion than you've ever shown your own wife. That sounds like love to me, or at least obsession that's preventing you from loving anyone else. Accusation hung between them, heavy with truth Michael clearly didn't want to acknowledge. What do you want from me, Grace? He asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Should I forget the girl who saved my life? Pretend those 20 years of searching don't matter? Lock this portrait away and never speak of her again just to make you more comfortable. I want you to see me, Grace said, her own voice breaking now. I want you to look at your actual wife with even a fraction of the attention you give that painting. I want you to wonder about my past and my dreams and who I was before I became your Duchess. I want you to recognize that I might be brave too, that I might have my own story worth knowing. Something in her tone made Michael look at her more closely, really seeing her perhaps for the first time in their 6 months of marriage. Grace, is there something you're trying to tell me? He asked slowly. She was so tempted to reveal everything, to tell him that the girl he'd been searching for was standing right in front of him, that she'd recognized him instantly on their wedding day, and had been waiting 6 months for him to see the connection. But looking at the portrait and hearing how he'd idealized that memory, Grace felt afraid that the truth would disappoint him, that the real her could never match the perfect angel he'd imagined. I'm telling you that you're wasting your life chasing a memory instead of building a future, Grace said instead. I'm telling you that your wife deserves better than to be treated like a consolation prize while you pine for someone who probably doesn't even remember saving you. She would remember, Michael insisted. Pulling someone from a frozen river isn't something you forget. Maybe she does remember, Grace allowed, Maybe she thinks about it sometimes. But Michael, she moved on with her life. She didn't spend 20 years searching for you. She grew up and faced her own challenges and became whoever she became. You're the only one still trapped in that moment." Michael looked shaken, as if Grace's words had struck something he'd been refusing to examine. "I need to find her," he said, but he sounded less certain now. "Grace, I've spent 20 years searching. I can't just stop now." "What if you already found her?" Grace asked quietly. "What if she's been in front of you all along and you've been too focused on the past to recognize her in the present?" "What are you saying?" Michael asked, confusion written across his face. Grace made a decision then, choosing honesty over the safety of continued anonymity. "I'm saying that I was there 20 years ago, Michael. I'm the girl who pulled you from that river. I recognized you the moment I saw you on our wedding day, but you didn't recognize me because you were looking for a 12-year-old girl, and I've grown into a woman you never bothered to truly see." Silence that followed was absolute, Michael staring at Grace with shock and disbelief, and dawning recognition as he compared her face to the portrait he'd stared at for years. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You're Grace Ashford, daughter of Earl Ashford. The girl who saved me was in simple clothing, clearly from a working family. How could you possibly be the same person?" "Because my life changed after that day," Grace said. "My father was Earl Ashford's land steward, managing his country estates. We lived in a cottage on Ashford property, comfortable but far from aristocratic. The day I saved you, I'd been out walking alone, which my mother constantly scolded me for because it wasn't safe or proper for a girl my age." She moved to stand directly in front of Michael, forcing him to see her. "After I pulled you from the river, after I made sure you were breathing and conscious, I ran home terrified of the trouble I'd be in for being out alone and getting my clothes soaked. By the time my parents heard about the young Duke who'd nearly drowned, by the time the Thornberry family came looking for the mysterious girl who'd saved him, I'd been forbidden from coming forward by my mother, who was terrified of drawing attention from nobility." "Your mother forbade you from accepting recognition?" Michael asked, clearly struggling to process this information. "She was afraid," Grace explained. "Afraid that if the Duke's family knew I'd been alone by the river, they'd judge my parents as negligent. Afraid that getting involved with nobility would bring trouble. So I stayed quiet while your family searched, watching from a distance as they offered rewards and asked questions throughout the area." Grace smiled sadly. "My life changed anyway, though. 2 years later, Earl Ashford adopted me after my parents died in a fire. He'd lost his own daughter to illness and saw in me someone who reminded him of her. So I went from being a steward's daughter to being raised as an earl's daughter, given education and training in being a proper lady. I became Grace Ashford legally, and the girl who saved you was buried under layers of aristocratic polish." "Didn't you tell me?" Michael demanded, anger mixing with shock now. "Grace, we've been married 6 months. You've watched me search for you while knowing all along you were right here. How could you keep that from me?" "Because I wanted you to see me as I am now, not as a memory from childhood," Grace said. "Michael, I recognized you immediately on our wedding day. I saw the boy I'd saved grown into a handsome duke, and I thought maybe our arranged marriage was fate bringing us back together. But you looked at me and saw only a political alliance, a convenient arrangement to secure family connections." Tears streamed down her face now. "You showed me polite distance while longing for a girl who no longer exists. That brave 12-year-old who pulled you from the river, she's gone, Michael. I grew up into someone more cautious, someone who learned that courage can bring punishment, someone who hid her true self to fit aristocratic expectations. I was afraid that if I revealed who I'd been, you'd be disappointed that the real me couldn't match your idealized memory." Michael sank into his chair, staring at Grace with a mixture of emotions she couldn't decipher. "Show me," he said hoarsely. "Prove you're really her." Grace moved to the portrait and pointed to a detail Michael had captured, a small scar on the girl's left hand. "I got this scar breaking the ice to pull you out," she said, showing him her own left hand where a faint white line still marked her skin. "The ice was sharp, and it cut me deeply. I have the same scar on my right knee from falling when I ran back to get help, though you wouldn't have seen that." She described the day with details no one else could know, The color of Michael's coat, the words he'd gasped when she'd pulled him out, the way his lips had been blue with cold, the terror she'd felt thinking she might be too late to save him. Michael listened with growing conviction and something else, grief mixed with wonder, as if he was mourning the loss of his idealized memory while discovering something more valuable in its place. "Been here all along," he whispered. "Grace, I've spent 20 years searching for you while you were standing right in front of me. How could I have been so blind?" "Because you were looking for a memory, not a person," Grace said gently. "And because I've changed so much from that frightened girl by the river. We both have." Michael stood and moved to her, taking her scarred hand in his and studying it with reverence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, I'm so deeply sorry for making you feel invisible while I chased a ghost. You deserve so much better than the husband I've been, the husband who was too caught up in the past to appreciate the extraordinary woman he'd married." "I'm not that brave girl anymore," Grace warned. "I can't live up to the ideal you've built, Michael. I'm cautious and proper, and I've spent years learning to hide rather than act boldly. If you're disappointed—" "I'm not disappointed," Michael interrupted. "Grace, you're still brave. Do you know how much courage it takes to tell the truth when you're afraid of rejection? You just risked everything by revealing who you were, knowing I might not react well." He pulled her closer, looking at her face with genuine attention for the first time. "And I can see her now, that brave girl in the woman you've become. She's still there in your eyes, in the strength you've shown enduring 6 months of my neglect while knowing we'd once shared something extraordinary. Grace, I've been an absolute fool." "Both have," Grace said. "I should have told you months ago instead of waiting for you to recognize me. We've wasted half a year we could have been building something real." "Then let's not waste any more time," Michael said. "Grace, I've spent 20 years searching for the girl who saved my life. Now I want to spend the rest of my life getting to know the woman she became, my wife, who saved me twice, once from drowning and now from living half a life chasing memories instead of embracing reality." He kissed her then, not with polite duty but with genuine passion and tenderness, and Grace kissed him back, 20 years of wondering if he'd ever remember her finally finding resolution. Over the following months, Michael and Grace rebuilt their marriage on a foundation of honesty and genuine partnership. Michael learned about Grace's life, the tragedy of losing her parents, the strangeness of being adopted into aristocracy, the courage required to navigate worlds that didn't quite fit. Grace learned about Michael's life, the guilt he'd carried about being saved while feeling unworthy, the way searching for her had become a quest for meaning and purpose. The portrait remained in Michael's study, but its meaning changed. Instead of representing an impossible ideal, it became a reminder of where they'd started, two children whose brief connection had shaped both their lives and ultimately brought them back together. Standing together in that study a year after Grace's revelation, Michael held his wife close and spoke words that had taken him far too long to understand. "I spent 20 years searching for the girl who saved my life, and I found her married to me all along. But Grace, you've saved me twice now, once from drowning and once from drowning in the past. Thank you for being patient with my blindness, for being brave enough to tell the truth, and for being exactly who you are." "Thank you for finally seeing me," Grace replied. "Not the memory or the ideal, but the real complicated, imperfect woman I actually am." Duke had spent 20 years searching for the girl who saved his life, never realizing she'd been standing beside him for 6 months as his wife. But the search had ended not with disappointment that reality couldn't match memory, but with the discovery that reality was infinitely more valuable, a real partnership built on genuine connection rather than idealized fantasy. And that truth, hard-won through honesty and patience, proved more precious than any memory could ever be.